So there seems to be a bit of confusion about how to pump your shock up correctly and get your air pressures accurate and consistent. So it's pretty straightforward, it's pretty basic, but I thought I'd touch on it anyway. So I've just taken the air out of this shock, and what happens if you take it out too fast? I purposely took it out fast to show you what happens if you're going to be changing spaces or anything like that. So if you just depress the valve really harsh, you'll notice that it sucks in. So what's happening is the air in the negative air chamber is still inflated. There's still air pressure in that negative chamber. It hasn't equalized as you've let the pressure out. So what you have to do, if you've had this suction where it goes all the way into its travel and you can't pull it back out, I don't recommend forcing it back out either. Put a little bit of air back into it until it starts to increase again, and once it increases back to full travel, it's probably 100 psi or 80 psi, it'll go back to full travel, and then you just push the suspension through its travel to that midpoint, to the point where you feel the two chambers equalizing. Push it, and then once they equalize, you'll notice that the suction effect's gone. So take a little bit of air out again, and you do it slowly. Don't do it harshly. Don't do shh. You want to just do a shh, just with an Allen key or whatever, and let it out. And take another 20 psi out or whatever. You know, just a little bit, and then cycle it through the suspension again. Then cycle it again, and then you get it to no pressure in there. You let all the pressure out, and the pressure would have been let out of both chambers, so you don't have that suction effect. So you can basically put the shock through its travel without any air, instead of having this suck down effect. So the next bit I'm going to talk about reinflating. So I'll set the camera up on a stand and we'll reinflate it. So pumping it back up a little bit, get it to come out of that sucked in travel. You see it's starting to extend already. We're at 60 psi, starting to extend back to where it normally should be. And I just need it to extend past it's usually around the 30% mark, or 20%, somewhere around there, where the equalization happens. So 80 psi now. Almost full extension. And when you're pumping your shock up, it's important that you got this hose onto this, where the valve is on the shock itself. When you're pumping up, you can't be erratic like this, because you'll put tension on the hose, which will put tension on the valve, and eventually you'll end up damaging that, or maybe even ripping it out, or blowing the seal, or doing something that's not ideal, and then having to get it replaced. So be delicate, you know, put the shock in a hand and have it steady, have it sturdy while you're pumping it up. So now I can feel that equalization port. I'm out past the equalization. It's right there. So it's probably at about 20% equalization. So I'm equalizing it. Now I'm going to start bringing it down. So that was about 115 psi. Bring it down, equalize it, bring it down, equalize it so it's not sucking in. We're at 40, 39, 35. And now I just take the rest out. 0. That's it, so no suck in anymore. That shock will move fairly freely throughout the travel without having to do too much work. So that's good to unwind that can and change your spaces over. Now, pumping it back up, this is one where the confusion is. So we'll reattach the hose, reattach the pump. Pump will do about 30, 35. Just equalise it, give it a couple of runs through that equalisation. It'll be at first, and then it'll be a very subtle, if nothing, and you know you can continue. You've equalised it properly. Just saves putting so much force when you're up to 150 or 160, trying to equalise the ports. So about 85 now. You hear that equalisation? Now it's smooth. So that's done. Again, no tension on that hose. It's got to be, it can't be wiggling around and pulling on that valve. That's super important because you're going to damage it otherwise. $130. Try not to let this, if it's going to dangle, make sure it's dangling out of the way of the bike. You don't want to be dinging your frame or damaging your pump. Same again, find that equalisation. You're not just slamming through it. You got to be not delicate. You just got to be consistent about it and intentional about it. So that's the equalisation there. No worries. Just make sure that's not unraveling when I'm twisting it. That's one thing to pay attention to as well. Because when you do attach this, you only have to attach it until there's a little bit of tension against your spin. If there's no pressure in there, if there is already pressure in there, you just attach it until you see it register on your gauge, and then just give it maybe a fifth of a turn. No, just a little nudge, just so it's well and truly on. But don't go any further than that because you'll damage the pump. You'll damage the stuff in here. So for 130, I'm going for 180. So I get it to about 180 or so, equalise it, and then we'll suss it out. So it's at 182. There's the equalisation there. It's getting more and more subtle, it's disappearing. Once that's equalised, now you can check your pressure. So it's at 176 officially. So that 181 wasn't what it is because the pressure hadn't equalised yet. So let me bring it up to, see, that's a perfect case of the hose not being on quite enough and unwinding while I was checking the gauge, and then it was half on, half off. So the pressure in here rose up and it just gave me a 225 reading. So you got to make sure that's on enough, but not on so far that you're damaging the pump. So now we're at 180. Equalise it. And I also like to just lift it up when I check it. That final check, that way it's consistent. So every time I do my pressure and I've finished the final, it's lifted up, taken the pressure off. There's no residual pressure from me doing this that changes the reading. So that's 180. If I was to check the pressure after doing this, it's 181. So it's only a little bit different, but it certainly makes a difference. So that's 180 psi, that's where I want it. Take the pump off, then check your sag. And if you check your sag and it's 2 or 3 mil too long, it's 35% instead of 30% or whatever you're looking for. You don't go, oh, I'm just going to put in another 5 psi, attach the pump and go 5 psi more than what you see on the reading. When you're attaching these pumps, most pumps, when you attach it, you lose maybe 8 psi at the back, over 150 to 200 psi range, and on the forks where you're sitting at 70 or 80 psi, you lose 2 or 3 psi. So keep that in mind. When you attach it, you're not just going, oh, I'm going to attach a pump. It'll read, so when I attach it now, it'll read about 172, maybe 173, probably 172 and a half. It's a digital gauge. There you go, 173. So I've lost 7 psi, it's just gone to 174. Yeah, so I've lost 6 psi. So if I was to go the sag was a bit deep, I'd go 185. And when I get to that 185, equalise, check, pump it again till it's 185 final. So you've equalised everything and it's all sitting where you want it to be. So maybe being a little bit too picky, but that's how you get it consistent, and that's how you have your bike feeling the same every time. You know these variables aren't any different, so when you're riding, you can just focus on your riding and your skills and going faster. That's 180 again. Double check, 180. It's all good. Easy as that.